Nicolás Maduro Moro, presidente reelecto de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, y voy a defender nuestra democracia, nuestra ley y a nuestro pueblo.
Nicolás Maduro Moros has won the elections in Venezuela, the re-elected president of Venezuela, thus revalidating his mandate for at least 6 years.
Primero, Nicolás Maduro Moro, del Gran Polo Patriótico, obtuvo 5.150.092 votos, con un 51.20%. El candidato Edmundo González, de la Mesa de la Unidad, obtuvo 4.445.978 votos, con un 44.2%.
Okay, yes I know, fraud has been committed. The result is a real farce, but what the hell did you expect? But let's see, for years we've been denouncing Venezuela as a cruel narco-dictatorship that controls the country with an iron fist. Why now, all of a sudden, would Chavismo suddenly go away by force?
No pudieron con las sanciones, no pudieron con las agresiones, no pudieron con las amenazas, no pudieron ahora y no podrán jamás con la dignidad del pueblo de Venezuela.
VisualPolitik community, in the last few weeks, many of you have asked us why we were not releasing new videos about Venezuela, why we weren't talking about these elections. Why didn't we do it? Well, the truth, we didn't expect anything at all. For months, a lot of media outlets, YouTube channels, politicians, analysts, and the Venezuelan opposition itself were inflating a huge balloon. Some for views, and others, perhaps for a lack of an alternative, told us that these elections, recall elections piloted by Maduro's own government, was something like a great opportunity to put an end once and for all to the damned Bolivarian revolution. They tried to convince us of an unprecedented negotiation by which the international community, and above all, the United States, were going to reward all these Bolivarian satraps with a kind of total amnesty for all crimes committed. From the executions denounced by the United Nations, to smuggling, money laundering, and connections with drug trafficking. The truth, I'm sorry to say it, but there is no other way to say it. Neither Barbados agreements nor Martinique. Why on earth would something happen in Venezuela, something that has never happened in Cuba, Iran, Belarus, Libya, or any other country in the world? Would the Chavistas really trust this amnesty so much they would give up power and risk their lives? Risk ending up like former Honduran president Juan Orlando Hernandez, just like that.
Juan Orlando Hernandez, former Honduran president sentenced to 45 years in US prison for drug trafficking.
And remember, this guy was supposedly a friend of the United States with good political relations in Washington. In 2019, Donald Trump himself publicly thanked him for helping the United States. But in the United States, politics is one thing and the courts are quite another. Diosdado did not have many doubts. 2 months ago, he said it very clearly.
¿Qué no sigues hablando de transición? Para ver, ¿no? ¿A cuál transición te refieres? Yo prefiero 1000 veces ser un necio que ser un cachorrito arrastrado al imperialismo.
And not only that, the problem in this case is that the amnesty would not only have to be for Maduro, Cabello, Padrino, and perhaps the Rodriguez family. No, the amnesty would have to be practically total for thousands of people related to robbery, drug trafficking, smuggling, corruption, torture, and crimes against humanity, recognized even by the UN. And let's see, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm sorry to say it was surprising. In Washington, nothing had leaked out. Chavismo seems to be at its best in recent years. Civil society in Venezuela was dismantled. Oil money was returning. Relations with Colombia have improved. And also in the current context, it does not seem reasonable that Russia or China would allow Washington to keep Venezuela as well. In other words, we have been taken for a ride. And keep in mind, Maduro himself has already left many clues.
Si no quieren que Venezuela caiga en un baño de sangre, en una guerra civil fratricida, producto de los fascistas, garanticemos el más grande éxito, la más grande victoria de la historia electoral de nuestro pueblo.
Let us speak plainly. The Bolivarian government had no reason to call these elections, no reason to hold them, and certainly no reason to allow the opposition to run. And no, don't give me that constitution stuff, because if we're really talking about a dictatorship in Venezuela, those things matter less than a shadow in the dark. And above all, they didn't have to accept fair play, and so naturally, they haven't. Venezuelans mobilized, went to vote, and said enough is enough. The results of the polling stations tell us that they gave the tyrant a sovereign beating. Of course, the official result is totally different. Although not even the Chavismo supporters believed it, because there were some long faces at Maduro's victory rally. But what difference does it make? That's what dictatorships and tyrants have. They don't accept the results of the ballot box.
We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
But then, what the hell were these elections for? Wasn't it like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already almost extinguished? Why didn't they do as Ortega did in Nicaragua, by de facto banning the opposition? Why did they allow the opposition to group, mobilize, and fill the streets? And above all, what about now? These are the questions we will seek to answer in this video. This is VisualPolitik, so enough with the jokes and cute stories. Let's see what on earth is going on in Venezuela. We need answers, because among other things, it has been Chavismo that has organized this whole huge charade. They are the ones who wanted these elections, and you know what? They got away with it.
Oh Dios que estás en los cielos, santificado sea tu nombre. Gracias por darle este triunfo a este pueblo que se lo merece después de tanto sacrificio, resistencia y lucha.
After almost 10 years of repression, censorship, and accumulation of power, Chavismo suddenly seemed to accept competitive elections. Yes, it created some obstacles, but it basically allowed political campaigning. The opposition duo of Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado toured the country in cars, motorcycles, and even canoes. They did it with relative ease. Yes, they tripped them up, but they did not stop them. They did not try to kill them. They did not even try to blow up their actions by sending in the military, the motorized collectives, or the regime's police, which for example is exactly what they do in Cuba when protests against the government suddenly arise. It would have been really easy. Basically, this is what they have been doing for years. For example, according to figures from the United Nations and some NGOs still working in the country, during the last decade, the Chavista regime has perpetrated up to 6,000 extrajudicial executions and more than 15,000 arbitrary detentions. To speak of the Chavista regime is, therefore, to speak of a dictatorship that is firmly established. However, this time it was totally different. And it has been different, not because Maduro and company had a sudden burst of democratic conscience or anything like that. The government wanted the elections, and this is the most worrisome thing of all. What happened on 28th of July may represent a turning point for Venezuelan history, a new turning point that we could describe as follows: from dream to nightmare. VisualPolitik community, let's hope we are wrong, but it's very possible that we are not facing yet another ploy by Chavismo to stay in power. It's possible that we are facing a change, and I'm sorry to say, a very important change for the worse. Now, let's start this story at the beginning. Suddenly, and against all odds, in 2023, the revolution and the opposition entered into a curious phase of political dialogue. The idea was to reach an agreement so that free elections could be held in 2024, thus paving the way for a democratic transition. Of course, in order to reach the agreement, the opposition opened up and showed all their cards, everything they would be willing to give up just to get the dictator out of Miraflores. Amnesties, economic and financial privileges, and even political awards. A whole post-dictatorship, all-inclusive package to ensure that not a rat was left inside the ship. And that is how the much trumpeted Barbados agreements were reached and finally signed last October 2023, supposedly with the approval and participation of the United States, which in exchange would have committed itself to lift the oil sanctions, and I stress supposedly, because there is no evidence of this, to suddenly pardon thousands of criminals of the narco regime prosecuted for federal crimes. The story, it must be said, seemed odd. A general amnesty from the United States for the entire regime. Why do something with Venezuela that they have never done before? Is this even possible? What guarantees would really be put on the table? Others even spoke of a golden exile in Russia, Dubai, or China itself. But why give up Venezuela and power and then depend on what others decide? However, perhaps out of sheer desperation, many Venezuelans trusted that all this would be possible. And with this, the Venezuelan opposition, consciously or unconsciously, gave a halo of legitimacy to an electoral process created by the dictatorship, controlled by the dictatorship, and executed by the dictatorship. And the problem is that we're talking about a regime that went so far as to invent a new parallel parliament, simply because the opposition had too much power in the usual parliament. They have never played fair. The problem is that it's something we all know about, so if you participate in the process and promote it, in the end, you are accepting it. As it is evident that the opposition was going to denounce the fraud, because how can you not denounce a fraud as blatant as this one? Chavismo already had its discourse prepared for what is to come from now on. And don't forget, very recently, in April of this year, the regime passed the Law Against Fascism, which imposes heavy penalties for those who encourage what they call extreme right-wing thoughts. And can you think of any far-right thinking more obvious, from their point of view, than an opposition running in an election and not accepting the results? In other words, we could be witnessing a trap.
He pedido a la Fiscalía General de la República mano de hierro con los terroristas, con los guarimberos, con los violentos, pero no vamos a permitir que ellos levanten una espiral de violencia.
This brings us directly back to the question we asked earlier. Why on earth did the regime want to hold these elections? Well, there are several possible explanations. We cannot know with certainty what the Venezuelan satraps are thinking, but we can put some hypotheses on the table and some objectives that the Bolivarian government may have wanted to achieve. Because in order to understand what is happening in Venezuela, the first thing we have to do is to try to discover what the real incentives of the regime are. Well, a first hypothesis, or a first objective, may have been to try to clothe itself with a certain national, and above all, international legitimacy. Something similar to what Putin is trying to do in Russia. Kind of like everyone thinks that, yes, Venezuela is a dictatorship, but hey, it's not Cuba. It's not such a bad thing. There are elections, there is freedom of expression, and there is even opposition. Nothing different from what happens in most of the countries in the world. Another hypothesis closely related to this one may be that of the punctured balloon. When a social majority is effervescently enthusiastic about something, and then suddenly that dream is frustrated, the result is usually widespread political apathy. Why get involved if nothing is going to change? It's impossible. It's not worth it. What's the point? We have to play with the cards we have. There is no other choice, etc., etc., etc. In the end, the result is that the opposition loses support. This is something that happens when change is very near, and in the end it becomes clear that it's impossible. In this line, Maria Corina Machado and her followers may have fallen into a political trap. The Chavista government has allowed a balloon of great expectations and hopes to be inflated, despite the fact that the end of the story was already written. I insist, in this way, the objective may be for Venezuelans to realize once and for all that there is no alternative, that any opposition, whether Machado or any other name, has no way to remove them from power. That is to say, to demobilize what little, if any, civil society remains. Another hypothesis is that the Chavista government has sought to cover itself with a new political cloak. Yes, in Venezuela, you will not have prosperity or freedom, but at least you will have peace and stability. And keep in mind, all that can be lost because of the opposition. If there is rivalry, we can go back to a spiral of violence, which would make us all even worse off. And remember that this is what Maduro has been repeating over and over again, both in the campaign and in his own victory speech.
Lo dije, va a haber paz antes. Y la hubo, durante y la hay, y va a haber paz, estabilidad y justicia después del 28 de julio a partir de hoy. Paz, estabilidad, respeto a la ley y justicia.
Of course, if Chavismo is synonymous with peace and stability, then they can also claim the legitimacy to strike a coup d'etat and dismantle the opposition for many years. This is something they have already done in the past. But be careful, the rebound of Chavista authoritarianism doesn't only affect the opposition, we may also be facing a witch hunt within the revolution itself. This could be the fourth hypothesis, or the fourth objective, that explains this whole enormous parade that has dominated Venezuelan politics for months. But do you want a concrete example? Well, when the European Union withdrew the sanctions against the Chavista hierarchs in charge of the National Electoral Council, Maduro and his followers cried foul.
Today we see how the European Union is taking some members of the National Electoral Council off the sanctioned list to supposedly send a sign of good faith or relief. You cannot say, I sanction these officials and not these ones.
The annoyance stems from the fact that some Chavistas, faced with the possibility of a real transition, began to negotiate guarantees on their own. That is to say, this operation could allow Maduro and his followers to discover the weak legs of their political criminal structure and carry out an old-fashioned purge. Well, these are 4 hypotheses that could explain why on earth the government wanted these elections to be held, and why it has played with everyone and laughed at everyone. But of course, now the question is, what about the opposition? Well, we'll talk about it in future videos, but I can already tell you that some people see the glass as half full. Yes, I'm not kidding. Check it out.
Isolated and split.
Although everything makes us see the glass as half empty, there are also those who put arguments to be more optimistic on the table. Chavismo has committed yet another electoral fraud, but this time the cost may have been higher. You see, although it's true that in Barbados, the main protagonists were the opposition and the United States, in this story we can also find other key players. We are of course talking about Gustavo Petro and Lula da Silva, who from the very first moment tried to pressure Maduro to accept to hold elections, more or less clean elections. For both the Colombian and Brazilian governments, the Venezuelan situation has become a major headache. Miraflores has allowed its border to become logistical centers for the trafficking of drugs, arms, people, illegal mines, and paramilitary groups. Virtually all of the border areas that Venezuela shares with Brazil and Colombia are plunged into crime, disorder, and chaos. Perhaps that is why they gave him one last chance by supporting this kind of amnesty plan for elections, and that is why things could now change.
Lula and Petro let go of Maduro's hand and accuse him of not complying with agreements with the opposition.
And it is not only the Colombian and Brazilian left that is turning away from a Venezuelan dictatorship that is increasingly toxic for them, but also the rest of the region's left is speaking out loud and clear.
The Maduro regime must understand that the results it publishes are hard to believe. We demand total transparency of the minutes and the process, and that international observers not committed to the government give an account of the veracity of the results.
In other words, Venezuela is going to become more and more isolated. Now all these countries can make a serious commitment to support the construction of a truly viable opposition. On the other hand, if these elections have done anything, it has been to reassemble an opposition that until now was practically KO. These elections have turned Maria Corina Machado into a kind of benchmark, a clear alternative for all Venezuelans. That was something that was not there before. If Maria Corina manages to prevent the general frustration from spreading throughout society, then we could have a more solid opposition with strong support from the outside. Sooner or later, this could allow the cracks that will emerge in the regime to be exploited. This is no small thing in a country where, according to UN data, poverty in the Caribbean country is around 82%, while 5 out of 10 Venezuelans live in extreme poverty. In fact, this situation could provoke a new exodus of young people in the country. So far, almost 8 million Venezuelans have left their homeland, and with Maduro in power, the situation could worsen. And what could be the consequence of this? That both the United States and neighboring countries will once again put Venezuela at the top of their agenda in the face of the threat of a new migratory crisis. Be that as it may, all this is an effort to look at the glass half full. Now, the danger, the great danger, is that the regime has had the prize they were looking for, that they will use their iron fist again to put an end to the hopes of millions of Venezuelans. Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez this time have not called for protests. They have made a call to the military. Check it out.
Y el deber de la Fuerza Armada Nacional es hacer respetar la soberanía popular expresada en el voto. Y eso es lo que esperamos, nosotros los venezolanos, de cada uno de nuestros militares.
But is there really any chance that anyone in the military could do anything? The truth, we aren't optimistic. If anything, the Bolivarian government has pushed to control the uniformed and make it so that there really are few people with power beyond their cronies in the revolution. VisualPolitik viewers, we would like to bring you better news, but what was honestly predictable has happened. The dictatorship has behaved as what it is, as a dictatorship.
Fascismo en Venezuela, la tierra de Bolívar y Chávez no pasará, ni hoy ni nunca. No nacimos el día de los cobardes, de los tibios, de los timoratos. Nacimos el día en que la luz del libertador parió esta patria. patria.
Of course, the future is open, and if these elections have shown anything, it's that Venezuelans yearn for change. And to all the Venezuelans who are watching us, I would like to say something. I wish you lots of encouragement. It may take time, but happier times will come. It's time to work for it. And on VisualPolitik, we are committed to do our bit by at least giving visibility to all that this horrible dictatorship entails. That said, now it's your turn. Do you think Chavismo will come out unscathed from this new electoral fraud? Are we witnessing a new authoritarian era in Venezuela? What do you think will happen? Leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you so very much for being there. All the best and see you soon.